The peaceful mornings of Edward, a retiree living a quiet life in a small town, were about to change forever. It began when he opened his arms to help a poor orphaned student sobbing in despair outside his gate. He never imagined that this choice would lead him from a quiet retirement into a brutal legal battle. A battle where he would have to risk his entire life savings and his home for a child that was not even his own. But this very choice brought him a happiness he had never known before. What did he do, and what did his heart tell him? Let us discover the story right now. Before we continue, please support us by subscribing to our channel. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. In the small house on the corner of Maple Street, that tick was often the only sound to be heard. It was a comforting sound for Edward. It was the sound of a life well ordered, the sound of a life lived exactly as he chose. Edward was a man who understood the value of silence. For over 40 years he had worked as a librarian in the county archives. He had spent his days surrounded by the hushed whispers of turning pages and the smell of old parchment. Now that he was retired, the silence had followed him home. It sat with him at the dinner table. It rested beside him in the armchair. He had never married. There had been opportunities in his youth, of course, a few soft smiles and shared dances at the local fairs. But Edward was a man of quiet habits. He found he preferred the company of his books and the peace of his own thoughts. He had no children, no grandchildren to run through the hallways or leave sticky fingerprints on the windows. Sometimes the neighbors would look at his solitary house and feel a twinge of pity. But Edward did not feel lonely. He simply felt still. Every morning began exactly the same way. The coffee pot would hiss and gurgle at precisely 7 o'clock. Edward would pour his favorite ceramic mug full of the dark, steaming liquid. He didn't like sugar. He didn't like cream. He liked the bitterness. It woke up his senses. He would walk out onto the wooden porch and take his seat in the high-backed wicker chair. From here, he could see the entire neighborhood. He watched the morning mist cling to the grass. He watched the squirrels dart across the street. And he watched his garden. Gardening was Edward's one true passion. He didn't grow bright, flashy flowers. Instead, he tended to a row of heritage rose bushes and a small patch of lavender. They required patience. They required a steady hand, just like his life. But one Tuesday morning, the pattern broke. The air was unusually cool for the season. Edward sat with his mug held between both hands, letting the warmth seep into his palms. That was when he heard it. It wasn't the sound of a bird or the wind in the trees. It was a sharp, jagged sob. Edward leaned forward. His eyes narrowed as he looked toward the sidewalk. A young woman was walking slowly past his gate. She was small, with dark hair tied back in a messy knot. She wore a faded university sweatshirt that looked 2 sizes too big for her. In her right hand, she clutched a sheaf of papers. The papers were crumpled. They were damp with her tears. She wasn't just crying. She was shaking. Every few steps she would stop and catch her breath, her shoulders heaving. She looked like someone who had just watched the world crumble beneath her feet. Edward was not a man who meddled in the business of others. He usually kept his head down. He stayed behind his fence. But there was something about the way she held those papers. It reminded him of a wounded bird trying to protect its broken wing. He set his coffee mug down on the side table. The ceramic made a sharp clink against the wood. The girl didn't notice. She had reached the end of his fence line and simply stopped. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the gate and let out a long, broken moan. Edward stood up. His knees popped, a reminder of his age, but he ignored it. He walked down the porch steps and across the lawn. The grass was wet with dew soaking into his slippers. "Excuse me, young lady." His voice was rusty from disuse. The girl startled. She spun around, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. She tried to wipe her face with her sleeve, but the tears kept coming. "I am sorry," she gasped. "I didn't mean to wake anyone. I will move on." "You aren't bothering me," Edward said softly. He kept a respectful distance. "But you look like you are carrying the weight of the whole world in your hands." The girl looked down at the papers she was holding. A fresh wave of grief washed over her face. She didn't speak. She just held out the top page toward him. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out his reading glasses. He perched them on his nose and scanned the document. It was a formal letter from the university housing office. The words jumped out at him in cold black ink. Eviction notice. Failure to maintain tuition payments. Immediate vacancy required. He looked at the second page. It was a letter from the registrar. Her scholarships had been revoked. Her academic status was suspended. Edward looked back at her. "What is your name, Grace?" she whispered. Grace, Edward repeated. The name felt light and elegant, a stark contrast to her current state. "Do you have family nearby?" Someone you can call Grace shook her head slowly. The tears fell onto the sidewalk. "I am an orphan, sir. I grew up in the system. The university was the only home I had left." Edward felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He looked at her tired eyes. He noticed the dark circles underneath them. He saw how she was instinctively guarding her stomach with her free arm. "Why did they revoke your aid?" Edward asked. "Were you not working?" "I was working 3 jobs," Grace said. Her voice was barely audible. "I worked at the diner. I worked in the library. I did cleaning on the weekends. But then I got sick." She paused. She looked at the ground. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am pregnant," she finally said. The words hung in the air between them. "The father told me it wasn't his problem. He told me to go away. When I started missing shifts because of the morning sickness, the diner let me go. I couldn't pay the tuition gap, and now I have nowhere to go." She looked up at him then. Her eyes were filled with a terrifying emptiness. "I have no one," she whispered. "I am 20 years old, and I am going to be on the street with a baby." Edward looked at the girl. Then he looked back at his quiet, empty house. The house with the spare room full of old boxes. The house that had been silent for 40 years. He thought about his roses. He thought about the lavender. They needed care. They needed protection from the harsh winter. But they were just plants. This was a person, a child of the universe who was being cast out into the cold. Edward didn't think about the risks. He didn't think about what the neighbors would say. He didn't think about how his perfect, orderly life would be turned upside down. He simply reached out and opened the gate. "Grace," he said, his voice stronger now. "It is too cold to be standing on the sidewalk. Please, come inside. Let's get you something warm to eat." Grace hesitated. She looked at the open gate as if it were a trap. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Edward smiled. It was a small, gentle movement of his lips. Perhaps he said, "But I know what it is like to live in a house that is too quiet. And I think you have had enough noise for one day." Grace looked at the house. She looked at Edward. Slowly, tentatively, she took a step forward. She walked through the gate and onto the path. As Edward led her toward the porch, he glanced at the clock in the window. The time was 8:30. His old life, the life of silence and shadows, was over. A new chapter was beginning. And for the first time in his life, Edward wasn't sure what would happen next. But as he held the door open for the crying girl, he felt a strange, fluttering warmth in his chest. It was hope. The interior of Edward's home smelled of beeswax and old paper. It was a clean smell, a lonely smell. Grace stood in the center of the living room, her damp shoes pressing into the polished hardwood. She looked small, fragile, like a gust of wind might blow her away if she didn't hold onto her backpack tight enough. Edward stood by the kitchen counter, his hand trembling slightly as he poured a bowl of vegetable soup. He didn't know how to do this. He hadn't hosted a guest in decades. Back then it was only a colleague from the library for a brief afternoon tea. Now there was a girl, a homeless, pregnant girl. "Please sit down," Edward said. He pointed toward the sturdy oak dining table. Grace sat. She moved with a stiffness that spoke of exhaustion. When she took the first spoonful of soup, her eyes closed. A small sigh escaped her lips. Edward watched her from the doorway. He was a man of logic and order. His mind was already cataloging the facts. Fact 1, Grace was alone in the world. Fact 2, she was carrying a child. Fact 3, he had 4 bedrooms in this house. 3 of them were empty. He cleared his throat. Grace, I have lived in this house for a very long time. It is too big for one old man. There is a room at the top of the stairs. It has been a storage room for a very long time. It is full of boxes and old magazines. He paused. He looked at the steam rising from her bowl. If you are willing to help me clear it out, you can stay there, for as long as you need. Grace froze. The spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and suspicion. You don't even know me, sir. People don't just give away rooms to strangers. Edward walked over and sat across from her. He folded his wrinkled hands on the table. In this world, Grace, there is enough cruelty. I have enough money, and I have enough space. What I do not have is a reason to keep the gate locked. Think of it as a job. You help me organize my clutter, and I provide you with a roof. Is that fair? Grace didn't answer right away. She looked at the warm light of the kitchen. She looked at the rain that had begun to tap against the window pane. I have nowhere else to go, she whispered. Then it is settled, Edward said firmly. Tomorrow we begin. The next morning the silence of the house was replaced by the sound of dragging boxes. The storage room was at the back of the second floor. It faced the east where the morning sun hit the strongest. But the sunlight couldn't reach the floor because of the mountains of cardboard. There were stacks of old magazines from many years ago. There were broken lamps. There were chairs with missing legs. Edward opened the window to let the dust out. The fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. We have a lot of work to do, he said, looking at the mess. Grace laughed. It was the first time Edward had heard her laugh. It was a soft, musical sound. It's like a time capsule in here, she said. Did you really need 3 broken toasters? Edward shrugged a bit embarrassed. I thought I might fix them one day. Time just got away from me. They worked together for 3 weeks. The pace was slow because Edward's back ached, and Grace had to sit down often. But as the boxes disappeared, the room began to breathe. They painted the walls a soft, creamy white. Edward found an old wooden crib at a garage sale down the street. He spent 4 days in the garage, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk. He stained it a deep honey color. One afternoon, as Grace was sewing a set of simple curtains, she looked at Edward. He was sitting on the floor, assembling a small rocking chair. Why did you never have a family, Edward? He stopped his work. He looked at the sunlight dancing on the new white walls. I think I was just waiting for the right moment, he said quietly. I kept thinking I had more time. I waited for a tomorrow that never looked exactly like I wanted it to. And then one day, I was an old man, and the silence felt like a habit I couldn't break. Grace put her sewing down. She walked over and sat on the floor near him. I spent my whole life moving from house to house. I never had a room that stayed the same for more than a year. This is the first time I've ever picked the color of a wall. Edward looked at her. He saw the way her hand rested on her growing stomach. The baby kicked. Grace gasped and took Edward's hand. Here, she said, feel. Edward hesitated. His hand was rough and spotted with age. He pressed it gently against the fabric of her dress. A small, firm thump pushed back against his palm. It was the strongest thing Edward had ever felt. His eyes blurred. In that moment, the room was no longer a storage space. It was a sanctuary. It was a nursery. They began to share meals every night. Edward learned that Grace loved history. Grace learned that Edward knew everything about the stars. He told her the names of the constellations. She told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher. The fear that had lived in Grace's eyes began to fade. She grew stronger. She looked healthy. And Edward felt his own heart waking up. He started buying fresh fruit instead of canned goods. He bought a soft rug for the nursery floor. He found himself humming tunes he hadn't thought of in decades. The neighbors noticed. They saw the young woman walking in the garden. They saw the old man carrying bags of baby supplies into the house. The whispers began, but Edward didn't care. He had a purpose now. As the months passed, the bond deepened. It wasn't the bond of a landlord and a tenant. It was something older, something deeper. A man who had no daughter had found a girl who had no father, and together they were preparing for a life that neither of them had expected. The room was finally ready. The crib stood in the corner, the rocking chair was waiting, the soft curtains fluttered in the breeze. Edward stood in the doorway, looking at the transformation. "Is it okay?" Grace asked, standing beside him. Edward nodded. He cleared his throat to hide the emotion in his voice. "It is more than okay, Grace. It is a home." That night, as Edward lay in his own bed, he didn't listen to the ticking of the clock. He listened to the silence of the house. But it wasn't the lonely silence of the past. It was a quiet, expectant peace, a peace that knew the world was about to get much louder. And for the first time in his long, solitary life, Edward was ready for the noise. The winter chill had finally begun to fade. The first green buds were peeking through the soil in Edward's garden. But inside the house, a much greater change was unfolding. It happened in the middle of a rainy Tuesday night. The quiet of the hallway was broken by a sharp gasp and the sound of footsteps. Edward was awake in an instant. He didn't panic. He simply put on his robe and met Grace at her door. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright with a fierce determination. "It is time," she whispered. The hours that followed were a blur of motion and soft voices. Edward drove with a steady hand. He sat in the hospital waiting room for a long time. He watched the second hand of the wall clock sweep around and around. He thought about his life. He thought about how many years he had spent sitting in waiting rooms alone. But this time was different. This time, he was waiting for someone who would belong to their little home. When the nurse finally led him into the room, the world felt still. Grace was propped up against the white pillows. She looked exhausted, but she was smiling. In her arms was a small, tightly wrapped bundle. "Meet Noah," she said softly. Edward approached the bed. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face. Noah had a dusting of dark hair and hands that were no bigger than Edward's thumb. The baby let out a soft bird-like peep. In that moment, a wall inside Edward's heart simply crumbled. He reached out a finger, and Noah's tiny hand closed around it. The grip was surprisingly strong. "Welcome to the world, little one," Edward whispered. Coming home was an adjustment. The silence that Edward had cultivated for decades did not just break. It shattered. And, strangely, he didn't mind at all. The house on Maple Street was no longer a museum of old books and quiet corners. It became a place of vibrant, chaotic life. The kitchen table was covered with bottles and drying racks. The laundry line in the backyard was constantly filled with tiny blue and white socks. The smell of beeswax was replaced by the scent of baby powder and fresh laundry. Edward found himself moving with a new kind of energy. He was no longer just a retiree waiting for the evening news. He was a man with a mission. He learned the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. He learned how to fold a diaper with precision. At first his hands shook. He was afraid he was too clumsy for something so delicate. But Grace was patient with him. "You are doing great, Edward," she would say. "He knows he is safe with you." Late at night, when Grace was deep in a much-needed sleep, Edward would take the night shift. He would sit in the rocking chair he had sanded by hand. The room was dark-lit, only by a soft nightlight. He would cradle Noah against his chest. He felt the steady, rapid heartbeat of the infant against his own slow, steady pulse. He would hum old songs, melodies he hadn't thought of since his own mother sang them. He told Noah stories about the stars. He told him about the vastness of the ocean and the beauty of the mountains. He spoke in a low, rumbling tone that always seemed to soothe the boy. "You have a big world waiting for you, Noah," he would whisper, "and you will never have to walk through it alone." The physical toll was real. Edward's back ached more than usual. His eyes were often heavy from lack of sleep, but he had never felt more alive. The stiffness in his joints seemed to disappear when he had to chase a rolling ball across the floor. The gray fog of his old routine had been burned away by a pair of bright, curious eyes. He began to see the town differently, too. When he pushed the stroller down the sidewalk, he stopped to talk to people. He showed off Noah to the postman. He discussed the best baby formulas with the lady at the grocery store. He was no longer the invisible old man on the corner. He was Noah's grandfather. Even if it wasn't by blood, it was true in every way that mattered. One afternoon, Edward was sitting on the porch. Noah was napping in a portable bassinet beside him. Grace came out and sat on the steps. She looked healthy. The hollow look in her eyes from the day they met was completely gone. "I was looking at my old journals today," Grace said. "Before I met you, I didn't think I could do this. I thought I would have to give him up. I thought I was a failure before I even started." Edward looked at her. He looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in the shade. "You were never a failure, Grace. You were just a person in a storm. Everyone needs a harbor sometimes." Grace leaned her head against the porch railing. "You saved us, Edward." Edward shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I think it was the other way around." He looked out at his garden. The roses were in full bloom now. They were vibrant and strong. But they weren't the most beautiful thing on his property anymore. The most beautiful thing was the sound of a soft breath coming from the bassinet. The most beautiful thing was the feeling of being needed. He realized then that his retirement hadn't been the end of his life. It had been a long, quiet pause, a preparation for this. He had spent 70 years learning how to be patient. He had spent 70 years learning how to listen. And now he was using all of it to help a new life take root. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. The house was no longer silent. It was full. It was loud. It was perfect. He reached over and gently adjusted the blanket around Noah's shoulders. The baby stirred and grabbed Edward's thumb in his sleep. Edward didn't pull away. He sat there in the growing twilight, a man reborn. He was ready for tomorrow. He was ready for the years to come. The peace of the morning was shattered by the sound of a luxury engine. It was a low, aggressive hum that did not belong in Edward's quiet neighborhood. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the bright morning sun like a dark mirror. Edward was on the porch, showing Noah the vibrant red petals of a blooming rose. The baby was reaching out with chubby fingers, laughing at the soft texture. Edward looked up as the car door opened. A young man stepped out. He wore a suit that cost more than Edward's entire garden. His hair was perfectly styled. His eyes were hidden behind expensive sunglasses. But even from the porch, Edward could feel the coldness radiating from him. Harrison. Edward had never met him, but he knew the name from Grace's quiet whispers in the middle of the night. He knew the stories of a wealthy family who viewed people as assets and feelings as weaknesses. Grace came out of the front door carrying a fresh bottle for the baby. The moment she saw the man by the car, the bottle slipped from her hand. It hit the wooden porch with a dull thud. Her face turned ashen. Harrison took off his sunglasses and walked toward the gate. He didn't look at Grace. His eyes were locked on the bundle in Edward's arms. So he said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth, "This is the child." Grace hurried down the steps and stood between Harrison and the porch. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was trembling, but she stood her ground. "You told me to leave. You told me you didn't want anything to do with this." Harrison leaned against the gatepost, looking around the modest yard with a sneer. "Things have changed, Grace. My father is getting older. The family estate requires an heir to secure the next phase of the trust. A child carries the name, a child carries the inheritance." He finally looked at her. his gaze sharp and condescending. "I am here for the boy." Edward stood up slowly. He tucked Noah's head against his shoulder, shielding the baby's eyes from the stranger. "The boy is not a piece of property, Harrison." Harrison laughed a short, dry sound. "And who are you? The gardener? Or perhaps some lonely old man looking for a hobby?" "I am the man who took her in when you threw her away," Edward replied. His voice was low, vibrating with a quiet power. Harrison ignored him and turned back to Grace. "Look at this place, Grace. A crumbling house in a dying town. You have no job. You have no family. You are living on the charity of a stranger who could drop dead any day." He stepped closer to the gate, lowering his voice until it was a hiss. "My family has lawyers who can buy and sell this entire street. We can provide him with the best schools and a future of immense wealth. If you fight me, I will bury you in legal fees. I will prove that you are an unfit mother with no means to support a child." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of rage. "You don't care about him," she cried. "You just care about your father's money. You won't take him." Harrison reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He dropped it on the grass inside the gate. "Consider that a formal notice. We are filing for full custody. You have no blood relatives to stand by you. And this old man, he is a legal ghost. He has no standing in a court of law." He looked up at Edward one last time. "Enjoy your little game of house while it lasts, old man. When the judge sees your bank account compared to mine, it will be over in 10 minutes. Harrison turned on his heel and walked back to his car. He didn't look back as he drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a heavy silence behind. Grace collapsed onto the porch steps, her head in her hands. The sobbing started again, the same desperate sound Edward had heard that first morning. "He will do it, Edward," she moaned. "His family is too powerful. They own half the state. I am just an orphan with nothing." Edward walked over and sat beside her. He put a steady hand on her shoulder. He felt the weight of Harrison's words. The man was right about one thing. On paper, they were weak. The law often looked at bank statements before it looked at hearts. But Edward looked down at Noah, who was now drifting back to sleep, unaware of the storm that had just arrived. He thought about the silence that used to fill this house. He thought about the life he had lived for 70 years, a life of playing it safe, a life of avoiding conflict. That life was over. "Listen to me," Grace Edwards said firmly. "He is wrong about you being alone. He is wrong about me being a ghost." He looked at the black sedan disappearing in the distance. A cold, sharp fire was beginning to burn in Edward's chest. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the feeling of a man who was ready to fight. "They have money," Edward said. "They have power. But they do not love him. They only want him for what he represents." He stood up, still holding the sleeping child. "Go inside and wash your face, Grace. We are not going to hide. We are going to prepare." Grace looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "But how we can't afford the kind of lawyers he has." Edward looked at his house. He looked at the garden he had tended for a lifetime. He thought about the gold watch in his drawer and the savings he had carefully guarded for his old age, the things he had saved for a rainy day. "The rain has started, Grace," he said quietly, "and I have a very large umbrella." The shadow of Harrison's visit lingered over the house for the rest of the day. The light seemed a little dimmer. The air felt a little heavier. But as Edward watched Grace rock Noah to sleep that evening, he felt a sense of clarity. He had lived a solitary life for a long time. He had lived for himself. But now he knew his true purpose. He was the wall between this family and the wolves at the gate. He went to his desk and pulled out a stack of financial papers. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the deed to his home. It wasn't enough to match a billionaire, but it was enough to make a stand. He picked up a pen and started to write. His hand was no longer trembling. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the steady, focused scratching of the pen. The battle had begun. The heavy envelope Harrison left on the grass was only the beginning. Within days, the official court summons arrived. The language was cold. It was clinical. It painted a picture of Grace as a woman with no means, no foundation, and no future. The lawyers hired by the wealthy family were thorough. They cited her lack of employment. They highlighted her status as an orphan with no family safety net. They argued that the only responsible choice was to place Noah in a home of immense wealth. Grace sat at the kitchen table staring at the legal documents. She looked as though she had stopped breathing. "They are making me sound like a ghost," she whispered, "like I don't even exist as a mother because I don't have a bank account." Edward stood by the window, watching the rain wash over his garden. He knew how the system worked. He had spent decades archiving the cold, hard facts of people's lives. The law liked certainty. The law liked collateral. And right now, Grace had neither. He walked over to his study and opened a small fireproof safe. Inside were the remnants of a lifetime of caution. The deed to the house fully paid for. The certificates for his retirement bonds. The statements for his pension. It was a modest fortune. It was the shield he had built to protect himself from the terrors of old age. It was his security. He took the papers back to the kitchen and laid them out in front of Grace. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This is our defense," Edward said. The next morning, Edward met with a lawyer in the city. The office was high up overlooking the gray rooftops. The attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice, looked over Edward's finances. She looked at the proposal he had written. Then she looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Edward," she said slowly, "do you understand what you are asking me to do? You want to sign a legally binding financial guarantee for this young woman and her child. You are pledging your home as collateral. You are putting your entire pension into a trust for the boy's upbringing." She leaned forward. "If the court grants custody, but Grace fails to meet certain conditions, or if the wealthy family sues for damages later, you could lose everything. You could be 70 years old and standing on the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on your back. You only met this girl a few months ago." Edward didn't blink. "I have spent 70 years being safe," he said. "I have lived in a house full of things that I was saving for a day that never came. I have enough memories of being alone. I don't need a house if there is no family inside it." The lawyer sighed and tapped her pen. "It is a staggering risk, Edward. The court will see this as a powerful statement, yes. It proves the child has a stable, wealthy benefactor. But for you, it is the ultimate sacrifice." Edward picked up the pen from her desk. The weight of it felt heavy. He thought about the way Noah gripped his thumb. He thought about the way Grace had transformed his dusty storage room into a place of light. He thought about Harrison, who saw the baby as a key to a vault. He signed his name. He signed the house away. He signed the pension away. He signed away the security he had worked 40 years to build. When he returned home, the air felt different. He walked through the rooms, touching the door frames. He looked at the crown molding. He looked at the quiet corner where his favorite reading chair sat. This was no longer his property. It was a wager. It was a bet placed on the hope of a better world. Grace was in the nursery, singing a low lullaby. Edward stood in the doorway and watched her. He didn't tell her the full extent of the risk. He didn't want her to carry the weight of his sacrifice. He only wanted her to know that she was no longer alone. "We have a lawyer," he told her that evening, "and we have a plan," how Grace asked. "How can we compete with Harrison's money?" "We don't have to compete with it," Edward said. "We just have to show the court that Noah has a home that cannot be bought. I have put up the house and my savings as a guarantee for your stability. The court will see that you are not a woman with nothing. You are a woman with a foundation." Grace stood up, her eyes wide with shock. "Edward, no. You can't do that. That is everything you have. What if something goes wrong?" Edward walked over and took her hands in his. "Grace, I have lived a long time. I have learned that the things we hold onto the tightest are the things that keep us from growing. I don't want to die with a full bank account and an empty heart. I want to know that I fought for something that mattered." He looked toward the crib where Noah lay sleeping. "He is worth the risk. You are worth the risk." The days leading up to the court date were a blur of nervous energy. Edward spent more time in the garden than usual. He weeded. He pruned. He made sure every flower was perfect. It was his way of keeping control in a situation that was spiraling out of his hands. He knew what the town was saying. The news of the wealthy family's lawsuit had leaked. People whispered when he went to the post office. Some thought he was a hero. Others thought he was a fool who was being taken advantage of by a young girl. Edward ignored them all. He had found a clarity that he had never known in his years at the library. He spent his evenings playing with Noah on the floor. He watched the boy learn to roll over. He watched him reach for a wooden block. Every small milestone felt like a victory in a war that hadn't even reached the battlefield yet. But late at night, when the house was dark, the fear would sometimes creep in. He would lie in bed and imagine the sound of a gavel. He would imagine a stranger moving his books out of the house. He would imagine sitting on a park bench with no place to go. Then he would hear a soft cry from down the hall. He would hear Grace's footsteps as she went to comfort the baby. He would hear the soft creak of the rocking chair. And the fear would vanish. It was a strange thing, he realized. By giving everything away, he felt richer than he ever had. He had traded his walls for a family. He had traded his pension for a purpose. The high stakes didn't feel like a burden anymore. They felt like a privilege. To have something worth losing everything for was a gift that many people never found. As the morning of the trial approached, Edward polished his best shoes. He pressed his only suit. He looked at himself in the mirror. He saw an old man, yes, but he also saw a protector. He walked out to the porch and looked at the black sedan that had come to pick them up. Harrison would be there. His team of lawyers would be there. The power of $1 billion legacy would be sitting across the aisle. Edward took Grace's hand as they walked down the steps. "Don't look at them," he whispered. "Look at me. We are a family, and a family does not break." He felt the deed to the house in his pocket. He felt the weight of his 70 years. He was ready. The silence was gone forever. The battle was here. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open with a slow and echoing groan. The air inside was cool and smelled of floor wax and old leather. It was a place where lives were reduced to folders and testimonies. It was a place where the truth was often buried under piles of legal jargon. Edward walked down the center aisle with his head held high. He felt the weight of his suit. He felt the presence of Grace walking beside him. She was dressed in a simple navy blue dress. She held Noah close to her chest, her knuckles white as she gripped the baby's blanket. Across the room, Harrison was already seated. He looked like a king on a throne. He was flanked by 4 lawyers in charcoal suits. They were whispering and shuffling through thick stacks of paper. When Harrison looked at Edward, he didn't see a man. He saw an obstacle, a small, insignificant obstacle that was about to be swept away. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, a woman with silver hair and a face that looked as though it were carved from granite, took her seat. She looked over her spectacles at the assembly. She saw the wealth on one side. She saw the quiet determination on the other. Harrison's lead lawyer stood up first. His voice was smooth like oil poured over water. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a simple case of what is best for the child. My client represents a legacy of stability and immense resources. We have a biological father who is willing to provide a life of luxury." And on the other side, he turned and gestured toward Grace and Edward. "We have a mother with no visible means of support. We have an elderly man who is not a relative. A man who has recklessly pledged his home to cover a situation he has no business being in. The choice is clear. Blood must follow blood." Grace bowed her head. Edward felt the anger rising in his throat, but he kept his face still. He looked at the judge. She was writing something down, her expression unreadable. Then it was the turn of Edward's lawyer. She stood up and laid a single document on the table. "Your Honor," she said, "stability is not measured only in dollars. It is measured in the presence of those who stay when things get difficult. Mr. Edward has pledged everything he owns because he believes in this family. He is a man of honor. He is a man who has provided a home where my client was discarded by the very man who now claims to want him." The judge looked at the lawyers. She looked at Noah, who was reaching out to touch a stray lock of Grace's hair. The courtroom was silent. The tension was thick enough to feel. "I have reviewed the financial guarantees," the judge said. Her voice was deep and resonated through the room. "Mr. Edward, your sacrifice is noted. It is a rare thing to see in this court." Harrison leaned forward, a confident smirk touching his lips. He thought he had won. He thought the judge was simply being polite before handing over the child. However, the judge continued. "Before we finalize the custody transfer based on the claim of paternity, the law requires absolute certainty. As Harrison was not listed on the original birth certificate and denied the child at the time of birth, I ordered a formal DNA test. The results arrived this morning." Harrison's lawyer nodded. "Of course, Your Honor, we welcome the confirmation of the bloodline." The judge picked up a white envelope. She used a silver letter opener to slice it open. The sound of the paper tearing was like a gunshot in the quiet room. She pulled out the document. She read it silently for what felt like an eternity. Grace held her breath. Edward closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer for the boy. The judge looked up. Her eyes moved to Harrison, then to his lawyers. The smirk on Harrison's face began to fade. "This is a court of law," the judge began, "and the law is based on facts." The test was conducted using the samples provided by the petitioner, Harrison, and the child. She paused. She looked directly at Harrison. "The results are conclusive. The probability of paternity is 0%. Harrison is not the biological father of this child." The room didn't just become quiet. The room became a vacuum. It was a silence so profound that Edward could hear the ticking of his own watch. Harrison's lead lawyer turned to his client, his eyes wide with confusion. Harrison froze. His face turned from pale to a deep, embarrassed red. "That's impossible," he stammered. His voice was no longer smooth. It was high and cracking. "She said, she told me." Grace let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She looked at Edward, her eyes overflowing with tears she hadn't known. She had lived in fear of this man's power because she believed the lie he had told himself. The judge slammed her gavel down once. The sound echoed off the high ceilings. "Since there is no biological connection, the petitioner has no legal standing to request custody. Harrison's claim is hereby dismissed." His lawyers began to pack their bags in a frantic rush. They didn't want to be associated with a man who had brought a false claim to their firm. Harrison stood up. He tried to regain his dignity, but it was gone. He was just a young man in an expensive suit who had been proven a fraud. He looked at Grace. He looked at the child. But he didn't see an heir anymore. He saw a mistake. He turned and practically ran from the courtroom, followed by his team. The judge looked down at Grace. She looked at Edward. The granite in her face seemed to soften. "Ms. Grace," she said, "you have your son." And Mr. Edward looked up at the bench. "You may keep your house," the judge said with a small, knowing smile. "The financial guarantee is no longer required as there is no opposing claim. But I suspect that home is already in very good hands." Grace collapsed into her chair, weeping openly now. Edward put his arm around her. He felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. He felt the house returning to him. He felt the pension returning to him. But more than that, he felt the truth. The truth was that blood didn't matter. Inheritance didn't matter. Money didn't matter. He looked down at Noah. The boy was looking at him with wide, curious eyes. Edward reached out and touched the baby's cheek. "You are ours," he whispered. The courtroom began to clear out. The bailiff opened the doors to let the light in. Edward helped Grace stand up. She was shaking, but she was smiling. "Let's go home," Edward said. As they walked out of the courthouse, the sun was shining. The black sedan was gone. The lawyers were gone. The shadow of the past had been burned away by a single sheet of paper. Edward felt the cool air on his face. He felt the strength in his legs. He realized that he had been ready to lose everything for a lie, and because he was willing to do that, he had ended up winning everything for the truth. He took the diaper bag from Grace's shoulder. He took the lead as they walked toward his old car. The house on Maple Street was waiting. The garden was waiting. And for the first time in 70 years, the future was wide open. They were a family, not because of a test, not because of a name, but because when the storm came, they were the ones who stayed. The courtroom began to empty. The echoes of the judge's gavel still seemed to vibrate in the air. Grace remained in her chair for a long moment, her hand resting on the wooden table. She looked as if she were afraid to move. She looked as if she were afraid that waking up would bring back the nightmare. Edward stood beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension finally leave her body. "It is over, Grace," he said softly. The judge called them toward the bench one last time. She looked at the papers before her and then at the small family standing in front of her. "The court recognizes the unique circumstances of this home," the judge began. "Since the petitioner has been proven to have no biological claim, his suit is dismissed with prejudice." She turned her gaze to Edward. "Mr. Edward, you have demonstrated a level of commitment that this court rarely sees. While the financial guarantee is no longer a requirement for the case to proceed, I am granting a formal petition. From this day forward, you are officially recognized as the legal protector and godfather of Noah. You are his guardian of record." Grace let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon light. The world looked different than it had only 2 hours ago. The trees seemed greener. The air felt lighter. The heavy shadow that had followed them for weeks had simply vanished. Edward felt a strange sensation in his chest. He realized he was smiling. He hadn't just saved his house. He hadn't just saved his pension. He had secured a future for the two people who had given him a reason to wake up in the morning. They drove back to the house on Maple Street in a comfortable silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Edward looked at the porch. He looked at the garden. He remembered the morning he had seen Grace crying by the gate. It felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. In that old life, he was a man who measured his days by the ticking of a clock. He was a man who lived in a house of shadows. But as he helped Grace out of the car, he saw the truth. Family was not about a strand of DNA. It was not about a name printed on a piece of parchment. It was about the person who held the umbrella during the storm. It was about the person who sat in the dark rocking chair at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was about the heart that was willing to lose everything to keep you safe. The following weeks were filled with a new kind of peace. The legal battles were a memory. The threats from the wealthy family had ceased entirely. Without a blood connection, Harrison and his lawyers had no power. They had retreated back to their world of cold numbers and tall buildings. Edward spent his days teaching Grace how to prune the roses. He watched her grow more confident every day. She had enrolled in a local college to finish her degree. She was no longer an orphan drifting through the system. She had a home. She had a foundation. Noah was growing fast. He was crawling now, exploring every corner of the house. The silence of the hallways was gone, replaced by the thumping of tiny hands and the jingle of toy bells. Edward had never been busier. He had never been more tired, and he had never been happier. One morning, Edward woke up before the sun. He went into the kitchen and started the coffee. He didn't do it out of a rigid habit anymore. He did it because he enjoyed the quiet moments before the house came alive with noise. He walked out onto the porch. The sky was a deep velvet purple, turning to orange at the horizon. A few minutes later, the screen door creaked open. Grace came out carrying Noah in her arms. The baby was wrapped in a fuzzy blanket, his eyes wide and sleepy. "Morning," Edward Grace said. "Edward Grace." She sat down in the wicker chair next to him. Edward looked at them. The young woman who had become like a daughter to him, the little boy who had become his world. He thought about the storage room that was now a nursery. He thought about the bank account that was still full, but no longer the most important thing he owned. "Look," Edward said, pointing toward the horizon. A sliver of gold appeared over the rooftops. The first rays of the sun hit the dew on the grass, making the yard sparkle like a field of diamonds. The birds began to sing in the oak trees. It was a new day. Noah reached out his hand toward the light, babbling a soft, happy sound. Edward reached over and took the baby's small hand in his own wrinkled one. Then he reached out and patted Grace's hand. "We made it," Grace whispered. Edward nodded. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face. He felt the life pulsing through his home. The solitary man was gone. The silence was gone. In their place was a bond that no court and no test could ever break. They sat there together as the sun rose higher. Three people who had found each other in the middle of a storm. Three people who had built a home out of kindness and courage. Edward closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in the scent of the garden. He was home. And for the first time in 70 years, he knew exactly where he belonged. In the end, we learned that family is not always defined by the blood in our veins, but by the hands that reach out to catch us when we fall. A house only becomes a home when it is filled with the courage to protect one another and the quiet strength of a selfless heart. If this journey moved you, please tell us where you are watching from in the comments, your city, your state, or your country, as we love knowing where our stories find a home. Please subscribe to join our community and click the video on your screen now to discover another touching tale.